Hello everyone, welcome to the first event in our global webinar series. My name is Gemma and I'm from IDP IELTS in Australia. We have test takers joining us from all over the world today, from Australia to Sri Lanka and Japan. So wherever you are right now, thank you for choosing IELTS. In today's webinar, we welcome back IELTS expert Don Oliver. Many of you will remember Don from our last webinar series, or maybe you've even seen him on our new TikTok account. Tonight, Don will be taking us on a deep dive of IELTS Writing Task 1. If you have questions specifically about Writing Task 1, please leave them in the comments or question box, and we'll get through as many as possible today. We've got a lot to get through tonight, so Don, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. As you say, we're talking about Task 1, academic and general training. And I'm going to share with you some important information about this very special part of IELTS writing. Now, IELTS writing, as you know, has two elements to it, a Task 1 and a Task 2. And many people find that Task 1 is quite difficult. And I'll try and explain why it is and how you can make it maybe a little easier for yourself. So in this session, we're going to look very closely at both academic and general training, because many people need general training for purposes of immigration and to show an employer their level of English, and academic, which is also very important for people who need to get into university or who need professional registration, for example. We're going to look at the assessment criteria, the way that the examiner assesses writing, because this is the essential element that you need to understand to succeed in Task 1. And we're going to do something very special in this session. We're going to look at some examples of writing, and I'll try and show you where they are successful and where they could be improved. So let's begin with the academic writing Task 1, and we'll begin with the first assessment criterion, and that is task achievement. Now, if you've done an IELTS test before, you've done speaking and writing and listening and reading. In the speaking, there's no task achievement. But in writing, it's important that you are actually answering the question completely. What does that mean? Well, we give you some advice. We are always telling you at the beginning of an academic Task 1 to do these things, to summarize the information. Now, when you summarize information, that means you don't give every piece of information. You take the most important elements. You select the main features, and you make comparisons. We call this an overview in Task 1. If you don't produce an overview, a comparison, saying this is like that, but that's different from something else, then you will not succeed in this assessment criterion. When you are confronted, when you face a Task 1 task, you have to ask yourself some important questions. Ask yourself this: what patterns do I see in this graph, in this table of figures, in this illustration? There will always be patterns, because the people who construct these tasks will always construct a task that has something that is obviously a pattern in it. So what are those patterns? There will always be an exception to the pattern. These numbers are going up, but this number is going down. These are big, but this one is small. So look for that. If it's a graph, there will always be a time element, and that's the horizontal axis. Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it years? Think about that. Think about how many elements there are in the graph. How many things are we comparing exactly? And how many number values are there? Is it the size of a population? Is it the amount of money that people earn? Is it temperature? There are different number values. Let's look at an example. This is a typical table of figures. This shows the six largest countries in the world in terms of area. In 2012, they had a certain amount of people in them. They had a certain amount of land that produced food. And you'll notice here that the word arable is used. Well, you don't know that word, maybe. But in IELTS, we will tell you the meaning of a difficult word. And here, if you look at the bottom of the table, there is a definition. Arable land is land that can be used for food production. And then we have the area of each of those countries. Now you can see obviously that one very important feature is that Russia is by far the biggest country. And the other countries are fairly similar. But that's a pattern. But there are differences. So what are those differences and what are those similarities? Well, we can see that the area of the country does not really influence the population size, because Russia is by far the biggest, but it only has the fourth largest population. Smaller countries like the USA and China have by far more people in them. One element is that we can see very clearly is that the USA and China have an equal area, but very different population. There are exceptions. There aren't any exceptions to the general trend, that is that arable land leads to greater population, but we can see that there are exceptions in the size of population in terms of the difference between China, for example, and Canada and Australia, which have very small populations relatively. There is a time element here, and the time element is 1 year, 2012. Now, this is important. What tense are we going to use when we describe this information? You will use the past tense if you say 2012. If you don't mention the year, then you could use the present tense all the way through. When you compare things, you've got to compare 6 countries and 3 variables. Now, there are 6 countries. If you don't mention every one of those countries, you will be penalized. If you don't mention every one of those variables, the area, the arable land, and the population, you will be penalized. And finally, the number values are square kilometers, arable land, and the millions of population. But use different words. Talk about the area. Talk about the amount of food that can be produced. Talk about the number of people. These are ways to express the same meaning, but they will tell the examiner that you really understand the information. The other criteria, of course, we probably understand, but I'll go into them a little bit more deeply. In the first assessment criterion, which we just looked at, the task achievement, it's important to remember 2 things. Give an overview. As I said, make comparisons. Mention the key features. As I said, the 6 countries in our example and the 3 variables. The second assessment criterion is coherence and cohesion. And this simply means you are organizing your essay in paragraphs and you are using marking words to show the reader what you are talking about. Use words like so, but, as, because, after that, of course, obviously, first, second. The third criterion is lexical resource, and that means your vocabulary. And the important things here are that you should use accurate spelling, that you use natural words that are appropriate, and use some words that are less common. I'll show you an example of someone who has written an essay, a letter, in fact, in general training, and I'll give you examples of why they score what they score. And finally, grammatical range and accuracy. Accurate grammar is important, but also a range of grammar. Simple sentences plus more complex sentences. Okay, I hope you've seen the public version of the assessment criteria, and here they are. You can look at these on the IELTS.com website, the IELTS Essentials website. There are many websites that will show you these assessment criteria. And we're going to look at the coherence and cohesion column there, the second criterion, and you'll see there that a band 7 has a range of cohesive devices. You'll see that a band 8 has that, but also uses paragraphing very well. Paragraphing is a simple thing, really. If you have one main idea, you put it in one paragraph. Your next main idea will be in the next paragraph. A task 1 would generally have 3 or 4 paragraphs, an introduction and a conclusion, and in between a couple of body paragraphs. So let's look at these words that connect. For a table such as this, you might use words like in contrast, much the same, whereas. Here we are comparing. However, we are introducing something that is different. Similarly, we are connecting two things that are the same. Words like in contrast, whereas, much the same, however, and a word like surprisingly, which is an adverb, which shows that you are introducing something which is maybe not expected. A word like on the other hand, to describe something which is different. Let's have a look at this task. This is quite a typical task 1 task, and it shows how to do something. It shows a picture with some instructions about, in this case, planting a tree. If you look at that for a moment, you'll see that there is a sequence. You have to dig the hole, you have to put the tree in there, you have to add things to the hole, you have to stabilize everything with ropes. The sorts of words that we might use here to connect those ideas would be first, then, next. And we're explaining why we do it, in order to keep the tree straight, so that there is enough earth. After that, these are the words that you would use for this sort of task. They are the connecting words we're talking about in the second assessment criterion. Let's look at the third assessment criterion now, lexical resource, which simply means the vocabulary you use. And here you can see at a band 7, there are occasional errors in word choice and in spelling. I'll show you an example of this later on. At a band 8, this person does not make many errors in spelling or word choice. It's only occasional. And this person is also able to skillfully use uncommon words. This is an important discriminator, differentiator, thing that separates a band 7 from a band 8. Also at a band 8, the range of words that you have is broader. Let's look at another type of academic task 1. Here, this is a pie chart. The sorts of words that we might use in this sort of context are, well, proportion, percentage, majority, more than 2/3 of, less than 1/3, less than a quarter. If it's a line graph, what sort of words will we use? We might use words like a dramatic fall. We might use a phrase like a steady rise. We might say a significant decline. Do you see here that we're using the right adjective with the right noun? This is showing the examiner that you have a sophisticated understanding of word groups in English. The right adjective with the right noun. We might look at another phrase there, showed little change. Here we're looking at the right verb that goes with the right noun. So all of these things are assessed under the third criterion, lexical resource. And finally, we look at grammatical range and accuracy. And in grammatical range and accuracy, it's very important to understand that at band 7, we are producing frequently accurate sentences. There can be some mistakes, and I'll show you a band 7 later on. We're looking at good control of punctuation. Is this difficult for you? Well, read a lot and your punctuation will improve. We are also looking at the range of structures that you use. And at a band 8, there is a wide range of structures used. Sometimes people who do the academic task 1 writing forget important things. And these things are that they forget to actually understand at the outset, at the beginning, what the task is. They forget to ask those questions that I mentioned earlier on. What are the patterns? What are the exceptions? What is the time that this information is talking about? For example, if it's in the past, you will use probably the past tense. If it's in the past up to the present, you will probably use the present perfect tense. Sometimes a graph will project into the future, and then you will use a future tense or a present tense. It is projected that something will happen. They don't understand the quantities. Sometimes they get the quantities wrong. Instead of saying millions, they say thousands. Instead of saying 100%, they'll say 100. These are important differences. Sometimes they forget to rephrase the words that are given to them. Remember, if you just use exactly the words that are given to you, there is not much credit in that. You need to show that you have a broad vocabulary. Sometimes, and this is very important, a test taker will forget to include every key feature. Not all features are key, but if it's a key feature, then you must include it. Sometimes, and this happens too often, a test taker will forget to make those comparisons to create that overview. That will usually be at the end of the essay, or it could even be at the beginning of the essay, where you make a broad statement. Sometimes a test taker will forget to add numbers to support what they have written. This is a problem. You must always, if there are numbers, you must always include some numbers to support the description. And some test takers will forget that they have to write 150 words minimum. Do that, but don't write too many more. Don't write 250 words, write 150, 160, that's good. And finally, paragraphing is an important part of getting a good score in task 1. And make sure that those paragraphs are full sentences, not dot points, not subheadings. And the very final thing is check your work. You have a chance to check your work, and this could be the difference between a 6.5 and a 7, or a 5.5 and a 6. 2 minutes spent checking your work for obvious mistakes is time well spent. Okay, that's academic task 1. Let's look at the general training task 1 now. And if you're not interested in general training, don't worry about that. There'll be some important things to say here about lexical resource and grammatical range and accuracy as well. So the general training task 1 has a different focus on task achievement. Remember, in academic task 1, you had to describe the data accurately and fully and produce comparisons and overview. But in the general training, which is a letter, those sorts of requirements are not present. What you have to do with the general training task 1 is to understand that you are given a situation and you must understand what the situation is. We'll look at an example in a minute. You are told who you are writing your letter to. You must understand whether this person is a friend or if it's a stranger, if it's an informal letter or if it's a formal letter. You must understand that there are 3 or 4, maybe, points that you must include in your letter. If you don't include them all, you will be penalized heavily. You are always told how to begin your letter. If it is dear ... you supply the name. Dear John, dear Ali, dear Carlos. And that means it's an informal letter. You're writing to someone you know. We'll look at an example in a minute. If it is dear sir or madam, then that is a formal letter. You are writing to someone you don't know, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. The tasks in general training. The first thing you must do is understand the situation fully. You are told there's a problem. You're told there's a purpose. What is that problem? What is that purpose? Sometimes the task will say, you had some problems with an S. That means you have to talk about more than one problem. So read that very carefully. You are told which points to cover. It's usually 3 or maybe 4. Cover them equally. That means you might produce 3 paragraphs in your letter to cover the 3 points equally. Make sure that you understand who you are talking to. And that means, is it a friendly familiar, informal tone, or is it a formal tone? Let's look at the assessment criteria: coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, as they apply to general training now. As I already said, the first assessment criterion, task achievement, means cover all points and use an appropriate tone. The rest of the assessment criteria are exactly as we saw in the academic. Organizing your letter in paragraphs, using markers to help the reader understand what you're talking about, using accurate spelling for lexical resource, using a range of natural words, and finally, for grammar, using accurate grammar and using some complex sentences. Here's an example. This is an example of an informal letter. It's an informal letter because we can see at the bottom it says, begin your letter as follows, dear, ... Now this means that you are writing to somebody that you know, and in this case it is you're writing to the manager of a colleague. And you all work in the same office. You know each other well. So this does not have to be a formal letter. And the situation is you're organizing a dinner for a colleague. You want the manager to give a speech. And you have to give details of the dinner. You have to say why you think the manager should speak and suggest things that the manager could say. If you understand those things, then you should be able to write a good response to this task. But spending 1 or 2 minutes understanding the task is time that is very well spent. Okay, let's look at how you might begin and end this informal letter. You might, instead of saying something formal, you might just say, I wanted to let you know. Or, this is a quick note to invite you. Or it might be, I was wondering if. You might say something like, would you mind? You might say, do you think you could? You might say, to end, I hope to hear from you soon. You might say all sorts of things, but they are not formal things. I'm looking forward to. This is important. And if you don't know these ways of expressing yourself to a friend, do some research. Look at examples of informal letters or informal speech between friends, and this will give you an idea of the sorts of language to use. Let's look at other informal phrases that you might use in your letter, and so forth. You'll be surprised to know. By the way, how do you feel about that? Since we're on the topic, blah, blah, blah. However, I'm pretty sure you will. Of course, surprisingly. Remember, we saw that word in the academic task 1. You can use this word quite happily in an informal letter, formal letter, or in an academic task 1. On the other hand, likewise, you can use that in any context. So there are some examples of the sorts of words that you might use if you're writing to someone that you know. In other words, an informal situation. Let's look at another task, and you'll see it's similar in design. You're giving a situation and you are given some points to cover. But here you are addressing dear sir or madam. And this means this person is not a friend of yours, which means that you have to use a different style of language. For example, you would say things like, I am writing to inform you. I would be happy to. I would be grateful if. In response to your, I am writing to inquire about. Do you see how these words inform, inquire, I would be, are rather more formal? Now, this is a difficult thing to understand in a foreign language. But if you don't know about formal language, then look at some more formal types of communications. You'll find them on the internet, and that is the sort of language that is required for a formal letter. You finish a formal letter with yours faithfully. You finish an informal letter with regards, yours. Other formal phrases you might consider using in addition: I am dismayed to find. That means I am unhappy. You might say also, it appears that. Do you see these verbs have a more formal feel about them? I await your response, a more formal word. Apart from this, however, I'm confident that, of course, surprisingly, again, we can use that anywhere. On the other hand, we can use that anywhere as well. These are the sorts of words that connect ideas, and they are also words that will indicate to the examiner that you understand the requirements of the task. We're going to look at an example of a band 6.5, and we're going to see that this person is responding to this task. So look at this task carefully. The situation is given at the beginning. It's about the library. The local public library wants to make improvements. It wants ideas from the public. And you are writing a letter to the librarian. Do you know the librarian? Probably not. It's a formal letter. We ask you to begin, dear sir or madam. And you have to cover 3 points. Now, this is important. You have to describe what you like about the library. You have to say what you don't like about the library. And this is very important. You must make suggestions with an S for improvements. Not one suggestion, at least 2 suggestions. This is important because if you only gave 1 suggestion, you would not be addressing the task completely. Okay, let's see the sorts of language that this person uses when they write their letter. Now, this sample essay was awarded a band 6.5, and it's important to understand if you get a 6.5 or a 5.5 or a 7.5, it means that some of those criteria are marked at the lower band and some are marked at the higher band. It means that some of your performance is better than other parts of your performance. In this case, the task achievement is good. Those 3 points are addressed. The coherence and cohesion is not so good. The paragraphing is maybe not so good. Maybe the sentences are not linked very well with those words that we've talked about before. The lexical resource, the vocabulary is good. It gets a 7. That means this person can use uncommon words, and there are only a few spelling errors. And finally, the grammar gets a 6. That's because there are too many grammatical errors. So let's look at this essay. We're going to start by looking at the grammar. Have a look at this essay for a moment. Is it good or not in terms of the grammar? Well, it's pretty good. It gets a 6 for grammar. But if we look more closely, we can see some very obvious errors. This is in reference to your inquiry regarding the suggestions to library, the library. Full stop. I would like to give my opinion on this in this regard. My opinion. I have visited, present perfect tense, and problems, plural. A library must consist of a substantial amount of books. So here we have errors in preposition. We have errors in articles, a and the. We have errors in plurals, not using the plural form. These materials, plural, and organized, this is a verb form, can be, most of the people can benefit. We don't need the passive voice. This is the active voice we need, can benefit. At the same time, do you see here that this person has a lot of problems with prepositions, with verb forms, with articles, with plurals? Here we're using the wrong pronoun. The numbers of books you have, they almost cover, not it almost covers. In the library, the article. So do you see here that this person is making continual grammatical errors? That means that this person cannot get more than a band 6. The reason that they get a 6 and not a 5 is because we still understand what they're talking about. Those errors do not stop us understanding. And this is important. If you want to get a 7 though, you need to eliminate a lot of those errors. Now this person's grammar is not so good, but they have a good vocabulary. Let's look here at this part of the second part of this letter, and you'll see that in fact the vocabulary is quite good and the spelling is good. Here, there's one spelling mistake. Nowadays is one word. Here, this is spelt wrongly, or rather, this is the wrong word. You should relieve the problem. You should solve the problem. This word catalogue is not spelt correctly. We need O-G-U-E. This word indulge is a good word, but it's not spelt correctly. Now, those mistakes amounted to 5 mistakes. It was just good enough to get a band 7 for the lexical resource. We're going to finish very soon, but I just want to tell you what some of the mistakes are that people often make in general training, task 1. Sometimes the test taker doesn't understand the situation and the requirements properly. How many points do you have to cover? What exactly is the situation? Take some minutes to understand that. As in academic, rephrase the words that are given to you. Cover those points equally. And remember, if it says problems, solutions, then make sure that you give more than one. Think about tone. Who are you writing to? Is it a friend or is it a stranger? Is it informal or is it formal? And again, write enough words. As with academic task 1, use paragraphs. Don't use dot points. Don't use subheading. And always make sure that you check your work at the end. So your next steps are simple. And we have a lot of advice for you at the IELTS.com, where you can find preparation resources. You know, if you're listening to us now on Facebook, that there is a lot of good advice on Facebook, continually updated. There are free practice tests at IELTS.essentials. There are many things that you can access, and we are happy to answer any questions that you have. There are support videos and many other things. I'm happy now to take any questions, Gemma, if you have some.
Thanks, Don. That was fantastic. We have a lot of questions. I reckon I've got close to 30 that have come in. So we'll try and get to as many as possible. And if we miss your question, we're sorry. Okay, first one. Don, there are many IELTS experts on YouTube who say you should always follow the same order as shown in a graph, years, decades, starting from left to right or top to bottom, whereas others say you should look for a pattern and group them together. Which one's the correct approach?
There are more ways to do it than just those two. The important thing is logic. And it will depend on the task. If, for example, there is a chronology involved, going from the year 1900 to the year 2000, then it would make sense to actually follow those things. But it might be equally logical to look at if it's talking about countries and different performances in terms of their economy, it might make sense to look at one country and then look at the next country, no matter what the chronology is. There's no hard and fast rule except that you should be logical. So don't go from 1 year to way ahead and then back again and then back to the middle. Don't go from one country to another country to the next country and then repeat that. Just be logical. That's the main message.
Great, thank you. Alrighty, do examiners penalise test takers if they ignore certain parts of the table? As in, for example, they only discuss 4 countries if there's 6 listed?
Yes, that will be penalised because it's a key feature. If they mention 6 countries in the example that we gave, then you should mention the 6 countries. You don't have to give equal weight to those countries. For example, Canada and Australia are fairly similar. Small population, not much arable land. You might say Canada and Australia are similar in those regards, but you would probably spend more time on places like the difference between China, for example, or the similarities between China and the United States. It's not a matter of giving equal weight to everything, but you should mention them.
Okay. Alrighty, next question is it suitable to use adjectives and adverbs that convey the writer's feelings and emotions towards the data in task 1, such as surprisingly or interestingly?
It is. It's a perfectly acceptable. By the way, it's starting to rain where I am. Can you hear it?
A little bit. Have you got a tin roof?
Yeah, I have got a tin roof, but I think it's charming. It's showing an expression of surprise or inevitability or obviously. Use words like that. You will get credit for that because they are words that connect ideas. They are connecting words, and that will be assessed under the second assessment criterion.
Great. Okay, someone's asked, can you please comment on the breakdown of time to complete task 1?
Well, it's recommended always, you're told to spend 20 minutes on task 1 because task 1 is half the value of task 2. But you may find that task 1 is quite difficult for you, and you may find that you do task 2 quite easily. Now, if that is you, spend 25 minutes on task 1. It's up to you. If you can do a good task 1 in 15 minutes, spend 15 minutes on it, but you might take a little longer with task 1.
Right. Someone said, have you got any advice or suggestions on how to improve punctuation?
I would say read. Read as much as you can, because there you will see punctuation used correctly. And when you read, be an active reader. Some people read very quickly. My wife does that. I'm a slow reader. And when I read, I actually analyze what I'm reading because I want to be able to actually write like that myself. So if you're learning a language, be an active reader and say, why is there a comma there? Why is there a full stop there? Why is there no comma there? And then in that way, you will improve your punctuation a lot.
Thank you. Alrighty, someone's asked, do all 4 parameters carry equal percentage in evaluation of answers? Or does
They
grammatical...
No, they do. Yes, they are
great.
equal. 25% for each of those assessment criteria. And remember that task 1, each of the 4 criteria there are 25%. And task 2, each of those criteria are 25% times 2. Now, I'm not a mathematician.
Did that equal 100?
Oh, I don't know. Who knows? I'm an English teacher. But remember that 1/4 of task 1 is not 1/4 of the entire mark. It's 1/4 of 1/3. You do the math.
Oh gosh, I'm lost. Alrighty, someone's asked, what band score for lexical resource can a student expect if they do not actually paraphrase and merely parrot the question in their introduction and continue to do so throughout?
Well, they can expect a low score for their lexical resource because they are not showing the examiner new words. They are just using words that are given to them. Now, an examiner will say, well, they've used the words correctly, but they're words that we gave you. So there will be no great credit in using those words. So it's not that difficult to actually use a paraphrase, and you should practice doing that. Remember, I talked about being an active reader. One thing you might try is reading something and then putting it into your own words. In fact, this is a great study skill. When you take notes, you are not writing down exactly what you're reading. You are putting it into words that you understand. And this skill that a student needs at university is exactly the skill that transfers to an IELTS writing task.
That's a great preparation tip. Alrighty, next question. Is it necessary to compare and contrast in academic task 1, and will I lose marks if I don't?
When I was talking about comparing, and in fact, remember, you are told to compare in the instructions every time, that is really another way of saying produce an overview. And if you don't produce an overview, you will be penalised. And the penalty is quite severe. You can't get more than a band 5 for that first assessment criterion, task achievement, if you don't produce an overview. So please do compare and contrast, and this will help you produce an overview.
That answers our next question, which was, is the overview at the end of writing task 1 necessary? So yes, it is.
Yes, but it doesn't have to be at the end. It could be at the beginning. It could be in the middle. But it's probably more obviously appropriate to do it at the end.
At the end. Okay, someone said, Oh, that answers the next question as well. At
I'm
the end
a
of the introduction,
clairvoyant.
you are. We're racing through these questions. Alrighty, let me just read the next
You'll have
one.
to make up some, Gemma.
Okay, so going on to general training, I think is this next question. Sir, if the letter is to a manager or a colleague, shouldn't it be a formal letter as the manager or the colleague holds a superior position in the office? This
is a very interesting question. And it's a question not about IELTS, it's a question about culture. In English culture, in Australian culture, in American culture, the distance between your manager and yourself is not very great, even at IDP. But in some cultures, it is quite great. Now, if you come from a culture like that, and I suspect this person might be from India, I'm not sure, but forget that. If you are told to begin your letter with dear, then that means it's an informal letter and you are talking to your manager as a friend, okay? So look at how you are told to start. If it says dear, then just use dear and then the person's first name and strike an informal tone.
Great. I think we're informal, Don, aren't we?
Yes, mate, we are.
Okay, someone said, did Don say we should spend an equal amount of words on each of the dot points in the question prompt?
Sort of. I would say that not necessarily an equal amount of, sort of. If there are 3 dot points in general training, then I would suggest you give each of those dot points pretty equal weight. Exact number of words, not necessary to count them or anything like that, but just try and treat them fairly equally.
Thank you. Alrighty, someone said a catalogue and catalogue, both acceptable spellings, spelt those 2 ways.
That's a very good question, and this thought occurred to me as I was doing it. Is OG acceptable in America? Is it an American spelling? I'm not sure. But from where I come from, it's a spelling mistake. But I take the point, and I will, after this presentation, I will go straight to Mr. Google.
Thank you. Let us know so we can clarify that one.
Absolutely.
All right. Someone said, can I use words moreover or furthermore in academic task 1?
Absolutely. Yes, you may. The academic task 1 is a fairly formal essay. And those words, they're not particularly formal, but if you use them appropriately, it's good.
Speaking of formal and informal words, someone's asked, can I use the word chuffed in an informal GT task 1, or is it too informal?
Good question. I think it's okay. It really depends. It is okay. If you're talking to your best friend, right? And you say, yes, I was really chuffed about the present that you gave me for my birthday. Perfect. If you're writing an informal letter to your manager, maybe not quite. And definitely not in a formal letter. So you've got to have an idea of that sort of the limitations.
Well, I'm pretty chuffed with how we're going here, Don. So
as long as the rain is not drowning out what I'm saying.
No, you're all good. Okay. Good. Someone's asked, is it necessary to use fancy vocab to get a band 7 and above, or is normal vocab okay?
It's a good question. Fancy and normal. Well, the word that we use is uncommon or less common. Fancy vocabulary are words that are maybe rare words that are used. So forget about fancy words, but less common words, for example, like if I'm talking about the business, and I'm talking about, you know, the profit and loss spreadsheet, well, that's sufficiently uncommon to give you credit, but it's not particularly fancy. So think about that. Think about not the words that you would talk to your mate about when you're just having a drink on the weekend, but maybe words that are appropriate.
Thank you.
It's a bad answer. I'm sorry, Gemma.
That's okay. So someone here has asked, any tips or tricks on how to count your words? Now, well, we know in computer delivered IELTS.
Oh yes, you jumped in before me. I was going to show that I was not a digital immigrant. In the computer test, as you say, you are given a word count. In the written, the pencil and paper test, you need not to count every word, but you should have a good idea that maybe you put 10 words in a line, and if you've written 15 lines, well, that'll probably be enough. That's all.
And last question, while we're on computer delivered testing, can you let us know how computer delivered IELTS is marked? Is it by an examiner or is it by computers?
It's marked by 2 examiners, the same way that the pencil and paper test is marked. So there's no difference. The computer test is marked by flesh and blood examiners for the writing, 2 of them, a minimum of 2, it could be more, as same as the computer and pencil and paper.
That's right, thank you. Alrighty, I think we'll finish up there tonight, Don. We'll leave it. Someone has said one of the best presentations, calm and clear, thank you a lot.
Thank you very much.
So
you should have seen me 5 minutes before the session. It wasn't calm and clear.
We had a few tech troubles, didn't we? But we got there in the end.
We got there.
Okay, I've got a few shout outs before we wrap up today. So thank you, Don, for joining, and thank you everyone else who joined. We'll be back. This recording of this webinar will be on our IELTS Essentials Facebook page. So if you'd like to go back and check something that Don mentioned tonight, you can go back and watch the recording on that Facebook account. Please visit IELTS.com to download a copy of IELTS support tools, which Don mentioned, which is your guide to test day and test preparation. And Don, I believe we'll be back in 2 weeks' time on the 8th of October, same time, 5 p.m, for a session on IELTS myth busting. And if you can't wait to see Don until then, please follow us on TikTok at IELTS, and you can see Don on our TikTok. Did you know that, Don? Oh, you're on mute.
That's news to me, but I'll be there.
Awesome. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for joining. See you next time.
Bye.